Recording in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, wherever you are in the world. My name is John Curry. I'm an academic at Bath Spa University in the UK, and I spend a lot of time playing games. When I'm not playing games, I write about games. Probably I'm best known for my History of Wargaming project work. Today, what I'm going to do is talk about the influence of hobby games on the development of art and the art and science of professional games. Now, the importance of professional gaming in NATO and allied nations is clearly on the rise, though there are some indications, it might take a back step at the moment. Anyway, that's a different talk. We've now seen a whole series of wargaming handbooks published. I've listed the key ones there. But interesting enough, actually, there are gaps in the professional coverage, and there's no indication to me that those are going to be covered anytime soon. Like, where's the wargaming handbook for the United States Air Force, for example? If there is one, pop it in the chat. Now, other countries are trying to develop wargaming capacity. At the bottom left, by the way, that is Chinese students playing at the Sandhurst Kriegspiel. It's called the Sandhurst Kriegspiel because it's based on a map of Barossa, which is the training area next to Sandhurst. Back-to-back game, and they're playing, I assume, with platoons. And why are these other countries interested? Because war games can save lives. That's Matt Caffrey. On the bottom right, by the way, those of you who are not very good at Arabic, it's the Iranian Journal of Wargaming, by the way. So other countries are trying to develop it because they see it as critical to add to their warfighting capacity. Now, there are significant gaps in our understanding of wargaming history, hobby and professional, especially professional. For example, Dunkempf, illustrated on the right-hand side. This was a very important tactical training game, which was based on the WRG hobby rules from the UK, and it was distributed to many American units. There were variants of the rules. For example, the heavy tank variant. There was a variant for infantry combat for the American officer training program at universities. There was a paratrooper variant anyway. But this story almost got forgotten until I rediscovered these rules and contacted the authors and then published a book about it. Now, I'm giving another example where understanding has changed. The Naval War College Games, which were run between 1919 and 1941, were held up as the epitome of professional wargaming and how predictive and useful they were. So when I talked about this, when I came to Connections US actually, and challenged it, it was quite interesting to see some people in the audience backflipping what they were saying almost mid-sentence, because it dawned on them that I was probably the only person in the room who had actually played some of these games. So as I explore the history of wargaming, you read the games, but it's only when you actually start to play them, it develops your understanding further. So our Naval War College games, they were very useful, but they were expecting daylight actions, and they really were not anticipating in the Pacific the battles were going to be fought at night. They thought it was going to be Jutland, long-range gunnery duels, shooting from 10 miles away, but of course it wasn't like that. And the role of the aircraft in the opening stage of the war, they underestimated it. Now, of course, we have a lot more balanced view of games, and we now realize that actually the games were really useful, and that probably their key use was training the flexibility of mind. So when those naval officers went into combat, sometimes they may know other people on their ships and on their own ships and other ships because they played games with them, but also they just had flexibility of mind to adapt to the realities of combat. So the scale of hobby wargaming against professional. Well, actually professional is about the size of a postage stamp on the average living room floor. Games Workshop, for example, they had a market value when I last looked it up of 1 billion in 2018. And of course, Games Workshop are probably the biggest figure game company, but they're only one of many. So the hobby sector includes playing with figures, historical, fantasy, science fiction, spaceships. It involves role-playing, Cthulhu, Dungeons and Dragons, and the myriad of other role-playing games out there. And it also includes some computer games, which are actually war games. And, a lot of computer games are not. They're just sort of puzzles which you have to try and solve. And of course, you can have role-playing games on computers. And of course, you can play figure games and role-playing games now with using computers. And of course, the board games hobby sector is absolutely huge. And if you include the Eurogame genre, which are interesting, challenging, interesting, challenging games, but aren't actually war games because they're not just about war, that's really interesting. The market is absolutely huge. I mean, the show at Essen in Germany, new manufacturers go along and they often take along 3,000 to 5,000 copies of their new game, and they expect to sell 3,000 to 5,000 copies over that few days show. Can you imagine that? Taking along truckloads of your games and anticipating you're going to sell the lot. So the scale of the hobby absolutely dwarfs professional wargaming. Now, the connections between the two branches of wargaming, I mean, they are just underreported. I mean, Matt Caffrey's 2019 book on wargaming is the book of the history of professional wargaming to date. It actually mentions hobby games 4 times, and it's 479 pages, by the way. I went through them one by one. Graham Longley Brown's 2019 Handbook of Professional Wargaming devotes 395 words to hobby wargames out of 125,000. But you've got to note in his book, by the way, the word hobby is used elsewhere in the book. So based on that evidence, I would say the connections between hobby and professional are somewhat underreported. Now, the emphasis on professional gaming has varied over time. Perla, for example, Peter Burford, hey, I think he's in the audience, isn't he? He's there to correct me my errors. He visualized the professional fortunes of wargaming as a sine wave with peaks and troughs, how influential it was. And at the moment, we've just seen some signs in the UK, for example, of the fall in wargaming. For example, Sandhurst, they had a very simple hex game, which they used as preparation for training. They moved the training area, so they obviously haven't got anyone who can make a hex map. And the counters, the young officers were stealing them. So the game's out of the curriculum. On the other hand, DSTL in the UK have increased the number of staff and doing a lot of interesting things. Now, we also have gaps in our understanding of the role and importance of war games. So it's hard to know about the emphasis on professional gaming, how it's varied over time. I quite like First Battle. I was listening to some American general, and I hadn't realized for 30 minutes he talked about the First Battle rules, how they were used across NATO, and how the American forces were using these in preparation for what we didn't know was going to be the end of the Cold War, and how they helped professionalize the plans. And he was absolutely confident that the exercises based around the war games in First Battle, how they upgraded the preparedness of the American forces. So maybe in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll be able to plot the relationship of war games to policy, but not quite yet. Now, the failure of professional wargaming to keep sustained traction is quite interesting. So wargaming history has been obscure, and it's been a pretty incomplete narrative until fairly recently. And one of the weaknesses is there's a lack of worked example of previous games for people to refer to. It's only fairly recently, for example, the US Marines are building up a library of war games for people to refer to. In this country, Sandhurst, for example, they're building up their wargaming library. In fact, they even had the nerve to ask for free copies of my books, would you believe? I said no, they could buy them. There's also been a lack of training courses. Moors do some very interesting work, but really they've only hit small numbers of people, despite all the efforts of people like Ed McGrady, for example. There's also, until recently, there's been few conferences on professional wargaming. I mean, the US Connections Conference kicked off in 1993 because Matt Caffrey was given an order which has never been rescinded. But it's only really when the UK started its professional wargaming conference in 2013 did professional practice, the dissemination of it, start to accelerate across the other NATO nations. We've also been hindered by a cult of personality, is my view. And some war games about the future of wars were basically full of errors. Oh dear. Well, let's just look at one of these, shall we? Now, Millennium Wars, Ukraine 2003, long time ago, no one can take offense. It was designed by Joe Miranda, Joe Miranda, It was published 10 years before the crisis kicks off in the Ukraine, had many interesting features, but the key weakness was, well, the Orbat scale was wrong. The game actually imagined Russia invading the Crimea and southeast Ukraine with 9 divisions. And it imagined NATO responding, would you believe, with armored divisions. I mean, the scale of it was just completely wrong. 10 years later. It was also a focus on kinetic and basically assumed that there was a crisis in the Ukrainian invasion, it would be like World War III, Third Shock Army advancing 10 kilometers down the road. And of course, when it did kick off, a lot of it was non-kinetic. A lot of the actions were decided by, section to platoon level, if you could call them sections or platoons. And for many months, the front line sort of vacillated many kilometers per day as individual groups advanced and retreated. And also, we didn't anticipate that many civilians would continue to live through the battle zone. And we didn't anticipate some of the opposing forces would actually share the same facilities, like going to the local supermarket or buying food off the same farmer. I can tell you some amusing stories of both sides lining up to be served in the bar, and they politely wait for the other side to go first. We hadn't anticipated that against, have we? So our professional games have been full of errors, and the problem is every time an error happens, it undermines the value of professional wargaming. So what I'm going to do now is I've set the scene. I'm going to demonstrate that hobby games have informed the development of professional practice over the last 100 years. So I could spend the entire time talking about the last 5 years or 10 years, but I think it's far more interesting to get the longitudinal view. And I am one of the historians of wargaming, so what would you expect me to do? Now, the first game with a political message, of course, is the new game of Invasion, 1888. It first came out, if you haven't played it. Have you played? Okay. So Lieutenant Henry Chamberlain was in the Royal Navy, and his perspective was England was vulnerable to invasion. It was part of a wider movement at the time. So he produced a game, and the game demonstrated how quickly the wretched French invasion forces could cross the Channel and occupy key locations. And his suggestion was that key defensible locations, Portsmouth, Plymouth, etc., should be fortified with coastal gun batteries. And these towns should have local reserve militias. These would mobilize, move to their fortified positions. They would then delay the invasion forces long enough for the British land forces to mobilize from across England, and also time for the Royal Navy to interdict the logistics supplying the invasion forces. So basically, if the French could get across and within 48 hours they could occupy, Buckingham Palace, obviously it would be game over. But if you've got gun batteries which would engage their invasion forces, fortified towns, many of the towns deploying militias which would ambush their supply lines or even hold up their main forces for a day's attack. Because, a divisional attack would take 24 hours to organize once you've got 400 or 500 men who are going to fight in a fortified position. And that might be sufficient. So anyway, the first game with a political message, although it was designed by a naval officer, he did it in his own time, and it was clearly a civilian game. It's published in the book on the right-hand side, the British Kriegspiel, by the way. Okay, now Bellum was an English Kriegspiel variant in 1909. Now, the importance of this, it was a hobby game, because they had representational terrain on the tabletop instead of actual maps. And that means you could, if you didn't have a map, well, you could just build the terrain you needed. And they use ribbons and string, etc., for contours, and cards with traditional maps and was on show woods, etc. So they could then generate flexible terrain as required for training purposes or to rehearse a particular operation. For example, a bridge demolition, an assault on a dockyard. You could do it. Now let's just have a quick look at the illustration. So there is Bellum. What can you see? So it's sort of a sketch map, quite clear what everything is. They've got a screen in between to make it hidden. But at some point when the battle is closed, the screen is then removed. You can actually see where the forces are, which is different from the professional Kriegspiel. Also notice that there are civilians taking part in the game, as well as uniformed services. And they also aim to play the game and finish in one evening, where Kriegspiel games would go on for days, weeks, as they ponderously move across with their 1 or 2 minutes across the battlefield. So see, it was the civilian innovation, which was used by the British reserves of the time, and also the regular forces. So Polymos, by the way, 1883. Now this is really interesting. It was a commercial excess. So those people who say, no, Tactics was the first professional board game, or first, sorry, professional, as in a professionally produced board game. No, that's just not true. There were a number of other professional board games beforehand, produced by real companies, and they were successful. Like this one went to 3 editions, for example. Now, what were the innovations in this? First of all, it was an open game. So you could see both sides, all forces, and the battlefield right from the start. Now, that's got some advantages. The hidden strength of the units was quite interesting, is when you set up with your forces, your infantry units, you would decide how strong your infantry unit was, and that would be kept secret from the enemy, so they wouldn't know how many hits it could take. I also like they had the classic books under the cloth to create the hills. They had little wooden buildings. And they also used 30mm figures as visualization. Now, all these things helped reduce the entry barriers to wargaming. And in this one, by the way, notice it looks like professional soldiers, but that also looks like a civilian playing the game. And if you look on the right-hand side, they've got a little timer there, and that's to put the players under a little bit of pressure. It was also a deterministic game, and it was a set of rules, and you didn't need an umpire for it. Now, there's still gaps in our understanding. Now, this is the new game of Aldershot, by the way, if you haven't seen it. I published the map in the hope that someone would come out and say, oh, I know where the rules are for that. Oh, by the way, when I found the rules for Polymos, by the way, there were probably only 3 copies of Polymos left. And that was the Victorian Collectors Club, were very kind and gave me a copy of the rules. That's the Victorian Games Collectors Club. Now, this one, interesting, Aldershot, well, home of the British Army. And you look at it and you think, well, hang on, what's this? Well, to me, it looks like a war game. There's contours, 3 crossing points. Well, that looks like marsh. Yeah. So it was clearly some form of war game. We just don't know what it was. But maybe further research or chance discovery in someone's attic will fill in the gaps for us. So on the land games, it was clearly the Kriegspiel games were played, but largely it was the hobby people were pushing forward with the development of games. This was the same in the naval area. So obviously we all know that Fred Jane was actually part of a succession of early naval games. And three Royal Navy officers, for example, all produced incrementally, were developing the idea of war games. But it was hobby, as in they were doing it in their own time. They presented these games at Russie in London. And I've reproduced actually in one of my books, actually, some of the classic comments where some of the serving officers rigorously attacked the use of games, says, this is ridiculous, you couldn't do this is unrealistic, etc., etc. But being fair, They were no respecters of rank, and they were quite prepared to have real professional conversations about their profession of arms, how to win wars, how to win campaigns, how to win battles. And to me, that's really good stuff. But actually, it was the civilian Fred Jane who pulled this all together and produced a comprehensive and generally accepted naval wargame. Now, there's an illustration of the naval wargame taking place in the George Hotel, Portsmouth, 1903, by the Portsmouth Naval Wargame Club. It had a number of officers, and it also had a number of civilians. So it looks like the main game there looks like umpires here as well. So how did the game play? By the way, if you've got to play it, it's a hoot, actually. It's just great. Basically, you have a striker, which is the pin on the end of a long stick. You hammer down every shot against the silhouette of the target. Depending on the range, it shows you how big the silhouette is. So obviously further range away, less chance of you hitting. You whack, 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 and occasionally a few of the shots actually hit. Now the umpires look at the rules and they look at the silhouettes and then they arbitrate, guided by the rules and their experience, about what the impact actually is. So I think if you hit a funnel, for example, there's a 1 in 13 chance you'll disable the funnel and the ship will start to lose steam. Interesting enough, actually, that the first wargaming playing aid was the Fred Jane Naval books, which then founded the Fred Jane Company, as in Jane's Company, all those books they produce. Anyway, it was actually a playing aid for his naval wargame. The games were used by Japan, Russia, Germany, etc. And I'm hoping to publish more information about what some of these other people were using these games for. So where have we got to in the story then? So the 19th century, Kriegspiel, great, but it was actually the hobby sector was pushing forward with innovation. And interestingly enough, it was naval, it was the same story as well. Now, there were a number of wargaming evangelists in the hobby gaming space who clearly influenced professional wargaming. And I thought long and hard about which ones to include, so I apologize to anyone I've left out. Now, of course, H.G. Wells, you think, what's H.G. Wells got to do with professional wargaming? So what he did was produce major abstractions into the Kriegspiels to make the game accessible. Okay, he played it with large toy houses, large toy soldiers, shooting cannon, but his breakthrough was, let's look at the Kriegspiel rules and abstract out what's unnecessary for the game. So intellectually, he pushed it forward. He obviously publicized the games with his book, Little Wars, as well. Absolutely great. If you haven't played a Fred Jane game, you've got to get out there on the lawn and give it a go. Now, Donald Featherstone, how can I talk about history of wargaming and not mention Donald Featherstone? Now, he's sometimes referred to as one of the fathers of modern wargaming, like James Dunnigan. And what did he bring? Well, he brought, and I got this from Phil Barker, who spoke eloquently when we learned that Donald Featherstone had died in 2013. He stood up at the Connections UK conference in London at King's College, and he spoke. He said, well, what did Phil Barker have to do with professional wargaming? And he highlighted, Don Featherstone, and he highlighted that what Don brought was personal experience of war, and he said of veterans, and said that if you design realistic games, you need to go back to these accounts, and your games must reflect what these people have said and seen. And his books were worked example of operational analysis. So he talks about a period of history, some of the factors about tactical and operational warfare, and decide which to include and the level of their effect and what not to include. And when I asked the question at the Connections Conference UK in 2013, about 1/3 of the people there said that they'd read a Donald Featherstone book, and that is what brought them into professional war, or what brought them into hobby wargaming, which then moved them into professional wargaming. So, Colonel Dupuy and the quantified judgment model. Fascinating to have a go with his rules. because they all sort of work, but not quite. But anyway, they're worth looking at. So what Dupuy did was create a deterministic model where basically you add up the combat factors on both sides, compare them, allowing for logistics, terrain, roads, network, fortifications, etc. And you come up with a mathematical model which is say which side advance, how far, and how many casualties it will take. What's less known is that Dupuy had partly been inspired by the hobby sector. So Dupuy took part in the Fletcher Pratt Naval Wargames in New York during World War II when he was passing, which got across to him the idea of modeling warfare through the use of algorithms to calculate combat power. Now, you probably think, okay, I haven't proved my case, but let's just look at this one. In the Dupuy books, he's got the operational lethality index, which is what you use to generate the combat power of a weapon, and you generate the combat power of a unit by adding up all the weapons in the unit. So on the left-hand side, I've got Dupuy's operational lethality index for aircraft. That was produced in 1978. This is Featherstone, 1968, in his book, Air Wargames. Combat value of weapons of the aircraft versus total value of weapons of the aircraft. Speed, punishment factor, half the weight of the aircraft, points for the protection, points for protection, not for the height of the aircraft. Okay, and okay, I think I probably made my point. So it looks like Dupuy was actually looking closely at the hobby and was lifting little bits of the hobby to inform his research. Now, of course, James Dunnigan. James Dunnigan, his work has been huge, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine producing a war game which sells over 300,000 copies nowadays? Gosh, SBI. And he set some of the key trends for the development of the hobby in North America. Now, one of the games he produced, 1976, was produced for the United States Army. It was under contract. Now, this is really fascinating. Now, the game was produced, then got edited, and they edited out some of the factors, the realism factors. And this was for political reasons. So let's just look at a map, an example of the situation. The Russians are advancing from the west. I'm sure they should be advancing from the east traditionally. And it's the American units on the east. So smoke going down just here. Now that's interesting. Okay, but look at the terrain. Each hex is 100 meters, and look how empty the terrain is. Look how empty the terrain is. So the US Army had insisted that Dunnigan remove the terrain, some of the terrain effects, because they were keen to demonstrate that the acquisition of the long-range guided missiles, which basically you shoot and they're on a long piece of wire, you need open terrain to use those. And if you've got tall hedges and trees and telegraph wires or telephone wires, that could interfere with your toys and stop them hitting the Russian tanks. So the easiest way, isn't it, to edit the terrain? I quite like the map of the swamp as well, got edited out. They removed the swamp from the training area on the map used in the game. They also removed the morale, insisted on removing the morale from the Russian side. So obviously Dunnigan decided to remove the morale from the American side, because they said it was un-American to have American units, I don't know, panicking or routing. So the units on both sides are invincible. There are some other changes as well, but fascinating. But there's an example of a hobby game moving into the professional arena. Now, actually, the game would have got further, but unfortunately, when it got to the UK, a certain Dr. Paddy Griffith at Sandhurst absolutely demolished the reputation of the game and said why it was no good for training purposes. It was too complicated. The ranges were all wrong, and the map was too open, and where were the morale rules, and etc., etc. And he said, where were the command and control rules as well? Anyway, so it was part of the reason why the game was not taken up for training in the UK. Perhaps it had, perhaps it would have gone further. Now, Paddy Griffith, as I've mentioned him, He was a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy at Santos, 1973 to 1989. And he was a key hobby wargamer whose work bridged the game between the professional and the hobby wargames. And he produced some really interesting games which were respected by the military, were integrated into the staff college, and actually helped end the Cold War. But perhaps that's another story. And all the time, Paddy was scouring the hobby market and lifting the brightest and best of individuals as well to inspire him, to help him run his games. That on the left, this is Paddy Griffith's counterinsurgency war games, which, very interesting for their time. We don't have many examples of professional counterinsurgency war games. Now, I could go on for quite a long time at other random examples. Phil Barker's WRG Modern Rules 1976 inspired Dunn Kemp. The evidence for that is I talked to Colonel Dunn and Colonel Kemp. They also inspired the Canadian Contact Rules, for example, and an awful lot of professional tactical level land combat games seemed to make mention to the WRG rules and said how useful they were in the development of the games. This is still going on. Sometimes we even know about it. I published a book about Confrontation in the Falklands, and I was somewhat surprised when several countries have lifted one of the games, edited it for their own own use, because it helps them prepare something they want to do. I thought they were very kind to tell me at all, actually. Because of the classification file, I never would have known what they were doing anyway. But anyway, they told me. So continually, we're seeing evidence that individuals on the professional side are lifting ideas from the hobby side. Now, there are many others in the hobby space who contributed to the understanding of our understanding in professional games. Now, I quite like this example. Though the operational Cold War Central Front war games, that's on the NATO Central Front, Spaces Aid is on the Rhine, they used to call it, the idea of the Ivan hordes advancing over the horizon with wall-to-wall tanks. Well, I was playing a game by Mega Blitz by a UK author called Tim Gow, and the game is actually all about trucks. And then I was sort of surprised to find that the war didn't seem to have enough trucks to support their divisions. So I looked it up. So in 1980, they had 1,500 trucks per division. But prior to the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, they had 250 per division. I never thought about this before. It was only playing the hobby game made me think about it. So I then casually stood up a conference and said, well, actually, prior to mid-1970s, the Russian attack would run out of supplies in perhaps 3 days. Of course, this is relying on the fact that the NATO forces fight to force the Russians to maneuver using fuel and shoot at them to force the Russians to use munitions. And the Russians apparently knew they didn't have enough trucks, so they were going to rely on railway lines. Gosh, railway lines through Poland. Civilian truck drivers mobilized from the Warsaw Pact economy to help. Gosh, those people would have been happy, wouldn't they? And also deliberate underestimates. But interesting enough, actually, that when I've looked at the Cold War games prior to 1980, not one of them highlighted the difficulties the Russians would face on the logistics front. They just didn't. And once again, I talked to people, and within one sentence, people have taken a mental backflip to say, of course they knew this, all the intelligence told them the Russian attack would run out of supplies, etc., etc. So my suggestion is the Cold War games, none have really highlighted the supply issues prior to about 1978, something like that, because they didn't realize. So there's an example of a hobby game which has contributed to our understanding in professional. And it's interesting, I've now seen in the academic publications, my casual statements of the conference have been taken up, unreferenced, and now everyone's saying, oh, of course we knew that. I'm sure there's many other examples out there. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the final part of my talk, how hobby methodologies have moved the professional. I'll look at matrix games, confrontation analysis, and of course, cyber war games. Now, matrix games. Matrix games were created by Chris Engel in the United States and were published in 1992. In the unlikely event you haven't played one, it was a method of superimposing a narrative on a conversation to make a game. So basically, you have a visualization of a map and you may have counters on there. You can argue for anything you want to do. You say what you want to do, why it should happen. Other people can support your argument or counter it. And then the umpire arbitrates it's definitely going to happen or definitely fail. And if not, you roll a dice for the roll of chance. But matrix games only got there because they were developed in the hobby space by some key people in the UK. Bob Corduroy, the author, John Armitage, and of course the ubiquitous Tim Price and others. So there's an example. Matrix games, wonderfully useful. They came from the hobby space, and that's where they were developed. Now, confrontation analysis. Now, this was a technique which was developed in the professional, but the author died. The general who recommended it retired, very inconvenient because of his age. But it was actually kept alive in the hobby space. And now the games have come back, or the methods has come back, and it's now been used to contribute to national policy. How does it all work? Well, the key way of seeing it is like a deck of cards, and each side has a card which says, this is my capability. And everyone takes a position on that, saying whether they want that person to play the card or not. And then you negotiate around the use of those cards, and basically comes down to, well, if I do this, will you do this in return? And it's quite a good way of modeling complex situations, I know, like Brexit, as well as former Yugoslavia. So it's interesting. There's an example. Started off in the professional space, kept alive in the hobby space, and developed and improved no end. And now it's returned back to the professional gaming space. Interesting enough, actually, someone tried to stop me publishing this book by saying clearly this was a UK government methodology, but I had to apologize that I'd already sold 1,000 copies of it. Whoops. Now, cyber war games. Now, secrecy has stifled cyber war game development. So what happened a number of years ago, I published Dark Guess, which was a working paper. It was nothing more, wasn't that great, but it was literally, you know, these are our initial ideas about gaming cyber. And I published it with the ubiquitous Tim Price. And then I discovered to my horror that there wasn't anyone out there working on cyber war games. So I've now published the Handbook of Cyber War Games, which is sort of an idiot's guide. It's sort of the next step up. And there's another book, I've left this free. There's going to be another book published by Ed Grady and myself as we're slowly pulling together more advanced ideas. So there is some interesting work going on in the cyberspace out there. This is cyber war games, but secrecy is stopping it. So really, it's the hobby space is pushing forward with the interesting and clever ideas. Now, random examples of hobby techniques. There might be early examples. These are just, you know, off the top of my head. So cards with rules. Well, SBI did it with Plot to Assassinate Hitler. This was a political game which treated a bit assassination of Hitler a bit like, I don't know, armored combat, really. But you had capabilities and equipment represented by counters. We now use cards. Step-by-step game tutorials. I saw a really interesting example of this about a game which represented or demonstrated that the British Army new piece of military hardware, which drives around the countryside, would be woefully ineffective in a combat against the Russians. And they included step-by-step tutorials to help officers and others learn how to play the games in the absence of the author. Well, where did those come from? Well, Avalon Hill, for example, Starship Troopers had the idea of step-by-step tutorials to help players learn the game. I mean, marker tracks for morale, production, etc. Well, I wouldn't even know where to begin where those came from, but it's definitely the hobby space. Force selection. So this is where you might give people perhaps an unrealistic range of options. For example, you're going to go into an urban space. What equipment do you take with you? Well, where did the idea to come from, as in to force people to consider options? Well, actually, it came from WRG Ancient Rules. And they openly said, these armies you create are relatively realistic, but it certainly makes you think about what number of elephants you want, the number of chariots you need, the heavy infantry, etc., everything else. Narrative superimposed on games, well, that came from Hobby Space. Random events, Black Swans, well, that was probably Don Featherstone's Advanced Wargames. Counters which have the combat table on them. So instead of referring to a combat table, you're looking for the value on the counter to generate that. Well, Decision Games Red Dragon Rising, for example, have done that. Now, I'm sure in discussion, we could suggest huge numbers of these ideas of hobby techniques, which have then jumped into the professional divide. Now, in order to introduce balance, though, you must be very careful. I've come across very few, if any, hobby games which you can implement in the professional arena without some serious editing. It's one thing taking the ideas, but lifting the entire box set or whatever, or the entire rule book, no way. I'll give you an example. We have wargame conventions like hexes, zones of control, combat resolution tables. And those sort of things do pose a barrier to understanding or immersion for non-wargamers. I mean, have you ever been on exercise and seen a hexagon when you've been in Germany or the National Training Centre? Do we have hexagons when you're fighting at sea? And what exactly is a zone of control? How big should it be? And should it really be one hexagon? Well, maybe if you've got an enemy brigade, you can't maneuver too close to them. But doesn't it vary depending on the terrain? Now, our games tend to emphasize fairness. In hobby space, balanced forces, equal ability to control units. We also expect to have decisive games. Now, this was brought home to me when I acquired from Tim Price an entire battalion worth of Russian training models. They were made of rubber, about 1/35 scale. So I positioned these on the countryside, and the British recce platoon advanced to contact. And in almost every single case, I ran this game, was it 10, 12 times? The British ended up closing with this battalion and the belief that somehow they could destroy this battalion because they never realized it was a battalion. And they made the mistakes, and we talked about it afterwards, that when they saw a Russian BMP, they didn't think, well, if I see one, there must be 3 or 4, because the Russians don't operate in penny packets. Well, not if you're representing the Cold War, they don't. So we had a warrior armored vehicle quite happily charging a company worth of BMPs, 6 ZSUs, and a company of infantry. And it was oblivious to that because the person couldn't believe their eyes, because why weren't the forces equal? So in hobby games, we do tend to prioritize fun over realism. Increase weapon effects for more eventful, shorter games. Now, this can extend into the professional arena. Those who've played the first-person shooter, America's Army or Virtual Battle Space 3, I would argue that although they model the firing of the individual bullets, probably they're overestimating the chance of hitting by maybe a factor of 100. Because we know from places like the Falklands and then World War II, what was it, 100,000 bullets or whatever to hit someone on the other side? It's just staggering numbers, thousands and thousands of bullets at the very least. And of course, if you then played that in VBS or whatever, I think the British Army squaddies would start to get bored if they were clicking, clicking, clicking. And on average, the soldier would run out of ammunition while they actually hit anyone on the other side. We also have in hobby games accepted norms, which are sort of leapt into the professional arena without perhaps analysis, like terrain effects, morale, weapon effects. For example, woods. Woods obviously hinder armored vehicles, don't they? They cost 2 movement points to go in. Everyone knows that. But woods is an oversimplification of a real piece of geography. So if it is Forestry Commission land in the UK, so it's publicly owned, there are forest tracks. And if you put an armoured vehicle on a forest track and they haven't used that track as a place to dump fallen trees and debris, the armoured vehicles will trundle through it just as they would across the open terrain. So we tend to simplify things in the hobby games, and sometimes you see that actually, well, yeah, they do. they sort of leapt into the professional arena and they're based on outdated research, no research, or just urban myths. For example, armored vehicles can't go into woods. Well, if it's an old established wood, the tanks can probably maneuver in between the trees. And if it's a new wood recently planted, the tank could probably go straight over the trees and flatten them. So anyway, that's for balance. Now, there is a lot of research going down on professional wargaming at the moment. I mean, I've got 5 PhD students where wargaming is a critical part of their methodology. I mean, I'm not the only place. King's College London also have 5. And I'm aware there's other people around the world starting to look at this. And what are they doing? They're looking at the causes of errors in professional wargames. And they're also looking at techniques from hobby games that can reduce the errors in professional wargames. And is this important? Well, probably. Because as we lift new techniques from hobby games to help professional wargaming, if we consider or we believe that professional wargaming really does matter, it matters because it trains the people who are going to fight the wars. It matters because it's the equipment those people are going to fight the wars with. It matters because the plans are based on those war games. It matters because nation states are making hard decisions which will lead to massive casualties based on those plans. Then anything we can do to make professional wargaming better, to put it on a sounder basis, is really, really important. So what I've tried to demonstrate over this talk is that if you look at the longitudinal history of hobby wargaming, it's clear to demonstrate that ideas and individuals and companies have influenced in a major way professional wargaming, and it's a lot harder to track the influence of professional wargaming on the hobby. So I hope that was useful, and I hope that was interesting. I'll be quite happy to take any questions.
Hey, John, I appreciate your overview. There are definitely things I learned. I have some questions I jotted down for myself, but a question from the audience says, I see a ton of titles with your name on it, which are the top 3 or 5 that you suggest I start with?
Oh gosh, if in professional wargaming, the book to start with is probably Peter Perler's The Art of Wargaming, because that's quite a good, it's well written. Yes, Peter, yeah, your book is well written. I will admit that. Even though I did edit the 2nd edition, my changes were very, very minor. And that places professional wargaming in a historical context and also place it in a cycle of professional practice. The idea wargames, people sometimes overestimate their value. So if you want to understand war or politics, what do you need to do? Well, the first thing is go and read a book, because someone's probably put a lot of time and effort into writing that book, probably many years. Then go to some lectures and find out what's not yet in the books, what people are thinking about. Go to some seminars where you test your understanding of the books, you test your understanding of the talks. And then when you've done that, play a few games. And after you've done that, consider what have you learned from the games, then go back and look at the books again, the seminars, the talks. So if you can imagine, it's sort of a cycle where the war games are only ever part of the process. But if you haven't read some books on strategy, war fighting, history, war games are interesting and entertaining, but really need to place them in a wider context. Okay, so Peter Perler's. The second book is Matrix Games, because Matrix Games are really easy and they're widely used, and they're also probably one of the best techniques we have at the moment to model non-kinetic. And I've got 3 books out there on Matrix Games. So pick one of those.
So I have a question, and this is more of a clarifying question. So when talking back to the Jane's war games, the naval war games that you mentioned earlier,
Yes.
When you said hammer away at the silhouettes, do you actually mean like they hammered at the silhouettes, or do they just fire at them?
Okay, so what they did, no, they had a long stick, and on the end of the stick was a nail. And you wave the stick by holding it at one end, and you're holding it and you're trying to hit a little silhouette on the table, which was on a cork mat. Then the umpire holds it up to the light, sees where the holes are, and that's how they know where the hits are. So they then go and look at the combat tables for penetration, decide whether or not they think it would penetrate the armor at that particular range. And then they would look at the rules and use the umpire's experience to decide what's the impact. So for example, obviously, if you've hit a turret and you've penetrated a gun, a turret, almost certainly you would have put that out of action. Now, yeah, it's a crazy system, I think Gabrielle's just said. On the other hand, it's fast, it's furious, and it's on a par with rolling dice or using a computer program to generate the hits. And the players feel more engaged because, they've got the stick and they're actually trying to hit it. But you could roll the dice and you'd have the same effect, but maybe not as engaging.
I have so many more follow-up questions on that because I love this idea. So hold on. So does that mean if you got close, was the stick the same for all distances, or do they have more nails on closer distances?
Well, they had multiple sticks, and because the pin would actually be underneath, you couldn't actually see where the pin was. So there'd be slight differences on the stick you picked up, and they changed they have multiple silhouettes depending on the range. So basically it's a smaller silhouette at the longer range. So you've got to fire a lot of shots to hit a little silhouette, which might be, 2 centimeters across, and you're holding a stick, which is, a meter long.
So they were literally carrying these, using these little sticks to essentially do shot groups. Oh, I love this idea. It reminds me of the range.
Yeah, but absolutely. It's on a par with rolling dice, isn't it? Because it's a random system. It's a Monte Carlo system.
Yeah, and Peter Perla mentioned it, is like the stick approach gives players agency for firing and has a lot of psychological advantages, which I can definitely understand, which you hinted to in terms of immersion and other elements to it. All right, I have to look into that more because I need to find a reason to use this method for work. How could the professional sector take more advantage of the civilian or hobby sector?
Well, first of all, it must break the stigma of admitting someone is a hobby wargamer. Practically everyone in professional wargaming who has risen up the ranks of professional wargaming, to me, when you actually look underneath the bonnet of their career, you realize actually, yeah, they all do hobby wargames. But you should openly be able to say. But I remember in Bristol, I was at a defense education conference, and the person, it was the Royal Navy, she stood up and said, yeah, I've just taken over professional wargames and and I've been doing it for 3 months. And of course, I was looking around, the hobby gamers who've done it for perhaps 20 years, and I was thinking, how do I even have a conversation with this person? I had the same with Rand, actually. A senior person in Rand just took over wargaming, and they were talking to me, and I realized they knew nothing. Where if I walk into a wargame club, you meet, what I call an intelligent wargamer who plays a wide range of figure and hobby games and role-playing games, etc. They just know so much as a starting point. When you put them into a professional environment, well, they're 5 years advanced from the professional warrior who's just been parachuted in, who's never rolled a dice in anger on a wargames table.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I think there is definitely a stigma related to being a hobby gamer in some parts of the professional realm, whether it be analysis or otherwhere, which is, I think, a shame because there's so much interaction between game design on the hobby side, like as you highlighted. And like this weekend, our team at CNA will be going to PAX Unplugged, which is a gaming conference in Philadelphia, just to play lots of games and interact with designers who are looking at all sorts of problems that are not DoD related. You always find a lot of benefit in it.
I'll give you a further example. In professional football in the UK, now a lot of clubs and a lot of senior players and a lot of senior professionals also take part in the hobby game, as in coaching other people. And there is no stigma about that. In fact, they always look bizarrely at a top player who doesn't contribute to their local club or help the local club in some way, pass on their expertise to young people. I mean, it'd just be yeah, you just couldn't imagine it. But in professional wargaming, yeah, there is a stigma about hobby games.
John, you're jumping on my soapbox, which I appreciate. The next question says, if wargaming is training for war, is hobby wargaming training for professional wargaming? If so, what are the top 3 training values?
Right. Now, James Dunnigan always had the idea that wargaming design was building a mental toolbox of techniques. So hobby wargaming is a way of building that mental toolbox of techniques. So when someone says to you, so at the DSTL interviews recently, they said, well, you've got to generate a game about a political subject. How would you do that? Well, you know, any hobby gamer who's designed games could tell you, oh, right, well, there's 16 different things you'd have to take into consideration. However, you cannot lift hobby techniques and parachute them into the professional arena without scrutiny and thinking about what it is you're actually doing. And I can't see. I've seen many war games. I mean, looking around my shelves at the moment, hobby games where I would say, yeah, I would use that as a training game for the military. No, yeah, you could edit it and use it, but I wouldn't do it directly.
So to follow up on that question, what are some things you would edit from commercial games using examples or more generalized examples of things that in the hobby game that you would elaborate on or add to make it a professional tool?
Oh, right. The first thing is, when you're doing it professionally, you've got to have an after-action review. And part of the after-action review to be to look at and articulate the abstractions and generalizations which have been included. So everyone knows what you've excluded for whatever reason. For example, you're playing your cyber war game and you say, right, we're going to interfere with the enemy logistics system by attacking. Well, hang on, what you've just done is you've just generalized and you've abstracted away the detail, which is probably classified anyway. So yeah, the after action review, so you are clear about what's realistic and what is not. That's probably the first thing. The second thing is combat in real life can often be indecisive. We were talking before the start of this talk about the Battle of Fallujah, just how long it took. Can you imagine a hobby war game? You said, yeah, you've got to attack that building 16 times in order to take it. No, they'd want to roll the dice once or twice, wouldn't they? So looking at the combat effects I've often found in hobby games, they're just too decisive compared with reality. So that's 2 things: after action review and looking at the combat effects against reality and the time to do stuff. I suppose the third thing is, since about World War II, it's taken units a certain amount of time and it hasn't really changed a great deal. Like a divisional attack, it takes 24 hours to organize a divisional attack. That's what it took in World War II. And guess what? That's what it more or less takes now. So the lead time necessary to launch an attack or to do stuff isn't always reflected. And in the computer games as well, I've seen that before. They model it in individual avatars and tanks and stuff, and then the brigade gets the order to move, and all the units trundle. Of course, brigades don't move like that. Platoons hardly move like that. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
No, that answers the question greatly. I think also one of the things I often, for my class, will always do is introduce echelons of command or logistics constraints, which a lot of commercial games either hand wave away or exclude because of accessibility and playability. And so no one wants to be the bean counter during a war, like a fun family night war game. You're like, oh, how many ATGMs did you use? Like, let me mark those off, right? And even officers and enlisted folks don't like doing it, but it is something they have to really think about. So another question is, which hobby game, not hobby war game, comes closest to bridging the professional wargaming? Any suggestions?
Oh, well, have you come across that Urban Operations, which was developed by that French officer? Hard to get hold of, but that's quite a good simulation of urban warfare. If you want an example of operation analysis, well, you've got to go and look at Harpoon, haven't you? They've got a new edition out there. Well, that's a non-trivial thing to pick that up. But I assure you, if you play some games of Harpoon, they might take forever, but at the end you'll understand an awful lot more about naval combat than you do this side. Operational games, I don't know, Red Dragon Rising, decision games. It's got some inaccuracies in there, such as you can only use one group of units at a time or whatever. Real war doesn't happen like everything moves all the time. But it does give you ideas of what a naval war would be like in the likely event one should happen, say, off Southeast China next week.
So on that note, I want to expand it in the sense of opening the aperture beyond just traditional war games like the SPI or the GMT games.
Yes.
What, in your own experience, or that you either designed or seen or written about or read about, is what are some games that are not traditionally war games, right? Like I think of like Citadels or other things that are not hex and counter or war focused, but that had interesting mechanics like negotiation or other things that you have imported or seen imported to professional or hobby wargaming.
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, any sort of games can help develop mental agility. So when I was doing work with the Ukraine, an interesting story how my university was doing work with the Ukraine. Perhaps because we didn't realize there was a conflict going in or something like that. Anyway, so I was looking at war games in the Ukraine, how good our games were prior to the Ukraine or prior to the conflict in Ukraine, how well they modeled what actually then happened. Actually, it wasn't that great. But I came across the best Ukrainian tank commander. He was a reservist who got parachuted into a tank, not literally. And in World War II terms, he would have been a tank ace. And it was very interesting the way he did it. He played chess. And so when he was out there in the combat, he saw it as a chess game and thought, well, if I do this, they could potentially do this. Therefore, I need to anticipate they'll do this, and I'll do this, etc. And, the Ukrainian tank forces, I mean, they got hammered. I mean, they lost 2 battalions in a few minutes, didn't they? But he did very well. And that was because he played chess. And he saw war game or real life as a chess game, and he simply outthought the enemy. So the places they thought he was going to be, he wasn't, but he anticipated where they could be. And as I said, interesting man. The Ukrainians tank case played chess. Okay, so back to hobby games. Oh gosh. Well, the Eurogames, there's a whole stack of Eurogames out there. And I'm quite fond of games by Martin Wallace, if you come across him. He is a games designer who we exported to Australia. You come across any games by Martin Wallace, the mechanics are always very interesting and are well worth looking at, whether or not they've got any applicability. Get out there and play some Euro games and see what they do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would also suggest PAX Premier by Cole Weir. It uses a really fascinating system that represents the great game in Afghanistan, and it doesn't have hexacounters. It has a very abstract little rug as a map and figures as both armies and bridges, but it uses a tableau card system, which I think is really fascinating, and I'm dying to use it in a game for work. So another question says, can you go back to the confrontational analysis and expand on that technique a little bit more?
Right. So confrontation analysis was based on experience of the conflicts in the Balkans. And the aim of it is to try and identify capabilities on each side, getting an idea whether or not the other side wants to use that capability. And once you do that, to try and speculate. So okay, let's do the card. So there's several variations. The card one, right? So if I was using it and I want to generate black swans, so what I did was I get together some really powerful and interesting people who knew a lot about a potential trade war between America and China. So they generate capabilities, and then for each capabilities they put a quantification on it are about what's its value. +5 is really good, -5 is really bad. So say, for example, you have America has a card saying sanctions on China. This is +2 because the Americans public would probably like the idea of sanctions on China until they couldn't get any toys for Christmas. What's the impact on European NATO? Well, sanctions on China would interfere with our economies terribly, -2. What about the Russians? Well, the Russians probably think it was highly amusing, so +1 on their card. China, -3. So you've got a capability and you've quantified what everyone's view on this is. So you hold this card and you have a whole series of other cards and you start to play them in sequences to disadvantage the other side unless they can persuade you not to. So then afterwards, you look at the cards and you think, is there anything interesting or original has been generated? And we found one, for example, which is if Vietnam really wants to upset the Chinese, I mean, really wants to get under the Chinese noses without spending very much money, simply hold a military parade about the triumph of the Vietnamese armed forces over the Chinese incursion of the border. And that would really upset the Chinese. And none of us had thought of that one before. But when you have these cards, it's also amenable to further analysis. And so you could have a confrontation where you could look at these cards and see whether you can model or create a win-win pattern. So if you can imagine, say, Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union, both sides have got capabilities. Well, it's possible to model that to decide if you can play in a certain sequence, can you actually get a win-win situation? So at the end, everyone ends with a plus score. I don't know if I've explained it very well there, but to me, it's an interesting method because for me, war games are the most powerful when you play a variety of different types of war games. I'll give you a quick example. I know I'm going on. So say, for example, hypothetically, the Russians decide to invade the Baltic republics. Well, obviously, you need a hex game, counters on the map, that sort of thing, model the battle. But you'd also perhaps have a use confrontation analysis to model it to see, can you persuade them not to? So is there a series of actions to persuade them not to? Maybe you could play a matrix game to explore the politics around the situation. So you see, you're modeling the conflict in the Falklands, and you're using 3 different games in addition to seminars and lectures or whatever to try and model it from different perspectives. I call that the multi-view. And that's a really powerful technique for developing a deeper understanding than just playing a single game.
So to go back to the confrontational analysis for a quick second, John, for when they decide on the values for these cards, is it during the game or in a series of workshops, events prior to the game?
If you've got the right people at your game, the time is really valuable. So the time to do it is probably live in the event, and that creates discussion, and discussion can lead to wisdom. So someone might say, for example, that if we impose sanctions on the Chinese, this will interfere with toys at Christmas, -2. And someone else will say, well, hang on, this will generate more jobs in the European sector because we produce a lot of toys and we can export them to North America. Oh, that's +1. Do you see, the game is a vehicle to focus discussion on the things you're interested in with the people you really want to get engaged in your problems.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. So one thing, I have another question that was sent to us prior to the webinar is, what is a publication that you think the wargaming community, I believe this is reference to the professional community, most urgently needs?
Oh, gosh. Well, in my own work, I'm trying to produce a series of handbooks, baseline books, which talk about things and have a number of different types of game to help you explore it. And as it's happening already, that the baseline books, the next generation are coming on with editing. So, for example, with Matrix Games, I published something on them saying, right, here it is, and here's 4 worked examples. And others have taken that and developed that further. So those baseline books, we're still out there at the moment. And what I'm trying to do is I'm talking to some really interesting people and try to capture their ideas about game design in a book by saying, right, let's look at a particular subject, produce 2 or 3 games, simple games, and talk about what are the design decisions you include in that game. So what we need next is to capture game design decisions in an accessible format. SBI always used to say, and Avalon Hill always used to say, the most read things in their rules were actually the game design notes at the end. We did entire books like that, but 100 pages, maybe 150 pages, 2 or 3 games, that's what we need. So the next generation of wargames can pick up what we do, absorb it, and go far beyond our efforts in the next generation. And they will.
John, I think that's an awesome idea. That is I'm not gonna lie, I love the designer notes of any of the old games. Even some of the more current games are giving designer notes. And I know in the age of the internet, many have like their own Substacks and other things that chronicleize how they're designing their games through Kickstarter and other elements, and explain their design choices. I think that for a designer is looking into the mind of another.
Yes.
Hopefully you get to do that work, and I look forward to reading it myself. So as I wait for last minute questions from the audience, one of the things that we discussed before was the webinar was, why is wargaming not as funded or as well researched in academia as other fields and disciplines? And I want to see if you can share your thoughts as educator and someone who has written and extensively on the history of wargaming.
Well, first of all, there is an awful lot of academic wargaming going on. Practically every British university, games are being run as part of the curriculum. They just don't highlight it very much. Every political, economic, business department, political, history, they're all going to have games. Why is it not funded so well? Well, one of the explanations, I'll give you, let's compare it to geographic information systems. So these are computerized maps and associated spatial analysis tools. GIS had a really hard time for about 10, 15 years, and in geography and geology, and getting people to accept it. Because the problem is, it was a paradigm shift in understanding. And geography books, a lot of it with the theories were narrative history with a few pictures and a few visualizations. And then along came these GIS people and said, no, if we use some big data and we have 15,000 points of information, we can in fact show sea level rise, we'll do this, this, this. And they'll say, so to the previous generation geographers, what are you talking about? It's nonsense. And there was a lot of resistance because the great and the good who'd established their reputations on the previous genre of techniques were not able, capable, or willing to take up GIS. So the problem for people today, or some people today in wargames, is wargames are paradigm shifting tools which model or get into a single model politics, kinetic, time, space, all these different things in a single model. And this rather stands on its head the narrative tradition and says, no, a war is like a story between 2 great generals and it's a clash of wills, isn't it? And fortitude and bravery and courage. No, it's not. It's about logistics, time, space, tactics, weapons, training. So to me, we're in that shift where wargames will become accepted as a critical tool. And if you're not good at wargames, you don't understand wargames, well, you're going to be sidelined. And I don't think some people are ready to be sidelined quite yet.
So another question is that I want to expand on is, what do you think the wargaming community that is not sort of policy oriented with government and so forth do to raise more awareness or funding to wargaming research?
Oh gosh, this is challenging. There are a number of organizations in North America, in the UK, and a handful of other places, and they're going to defend the large amounts of wargaming money which they get. And part of their method of doing that is the classification threshold, saying the only way you could play a political game about the Baltic republics is if you've got access to classified data, which will tell you how far a cruise missile can shoot from an astute. Hang on, you think, hang on, that's a nonsense. So there's a lot of defended interests out there. There's money being spent on Wargame, but a lot of it is most of it is going into a very few organizations.
So as I wait for any last minute questions, I have one last question that I see in the chat is, could you perhaps write a biography on key wargaming minds, drives, contents, personalities, military background, and so forth?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to get some help with that one. Someone said to me, actually, I'm probably going to be the last person alive, depending on how long I live, who actually knew in the UK, the Donald Featherstones, the Tony Baths, the Terry Wise, the Stuart Asquith, many of the great names who developed ideas in the UK. And I know some of the ones abroad as well. Could I ever do that? Well, I've got so many books to write. I've got 67 now on my immediate to-do list. I mean, I've got this really exciting book about pre-World War I naval war games to do, straight out of the archives, never been published before. Absolutely, examples of the games they were playing and the outcomes and what they said about them. I just got so much to do. I just don't work fast enough. Graduate students, absolutely. That's why I'm trying to recruit PhD students. Hello, Nick Riggs. I recognize that PhD student in the talk. Yeah, to try and get them to do some of the work. Absolutely, to advance their careers.
Youth is wasted on the young, eh? Well, well, I don't see any other questions here. So one of the last questions we like to ask in our 2021 series of webinars to our speakers is, if you had unlimited money, unlimited time, right? What is the project, game, initiative that you would want to do?
I want to publish half a dozen books by key professional stroke hobby wargamers to capture their ideas, basically extended game design notes. And I think that would be the most valuable contribution I could do to the next generation of wargamers, giving them half a dozen examples which they could take forward for their own ideas. That's what I would do if I had unlimited time and money and effort.
And last sort of administrative question is, if people want to follow up with you, John, where can they find you, reach out to you, find you on social media or at your university?
Yeah, you can find me. The History of Wargaming project is not that hard to find. I'm at Bath Spa University. Oh gosh, Dawn, there's another PhD student's popped up. Gosh, PhD students in wargaming everywhere. Yeah, Bath Spa University. So John Curry and Wargaming. It's an initiative testifying me. I'm more than happy to discuss it. I get queries from people doing wargaming research, probably out once every 1 week to 2 weeks. And I'm happy to help them I can, because behind my published works, I have the biggest wargaming archive in digital format you can possibly imagine. And sometimes that's very useful for people's work. So random example, the people documenting Dungeons and Dragons, well, I've been helpful to them because I've got access to stuff no one else has, and that's gone into their books, etc. I don't get any acknowledgement for it or any money for it. I'm just happy to help.
So on that note, John, I would like to thank you personally from the Georgetown University Wargaming Society for spending your evening or mid-afternoon with us. And this has been one of my favorites of this year's webinars. I learned a lot, and I am now just obsessed with how to incorporate the nail on the stick in naval warfare. I'm just trying to do it for missile combat and be like, here's your missile. This is how you have a better ISR, you have better nails on this stick. There's so many possibilities. But thank you, John. I appreciate it. And have a good one.
Pleasure. And you, thank you.